day, class. My name is Christine Boama. Our lecture today is on legal pluralism and the implementation of international human rights treaties in Africa. In this lecture, we are going to focus our attention on multiple systems of law coexisting and operating within our various jurisdictions. These systems of law seek for us to decide which one to apply in a given situation, whether in the privacy of our homes, at work, or even in international business transactions. For example, in the home, when a Catholic man decides to divorce his wife, he thinks of the possibility of his action violating the canon laws and thereby probably denying him of going for communion. And at the same time, he considers the state family laws, which sets out procedural requirements for him to follow in order to obtain a divorce. Within an African state, which is a party to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, a community may be torn between following customary laws to kill a child born with disability or following the state laws requiring the protection of such children, which are consistent with the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. For this lecture, there is a list of readings I would like to recommend to you, which is germane to understanding what we will be discussing. The first is John Griffiths' article titled, "What is Legal Pluralism?" The second is Brian Tamanahe's article titled, "Understanding Legal Pluralism, Past to Present, Local to Global." The third is Jacques Fremont's article, "Legal Pluralism, Customary Law and Human Rights in Francophone African Countries." And finally, the fourth is Anne Hillom's book, "Women's Human Rights and Legal Pluralism in Africa, Mixed Norms and Identities in Infertility Management in Zimbabwe." So by way of introduction, I'd like to recount an experience I had during Ghana's constitution review process. Now, Ghana undertook a review of the country's constitution from 2010 to 2012. Now, during the process, we consulted various categories of people on the operation of the 1992 constitution and received many submissions. One of the submissions was that politicians should be asked to swear by river gods not to embezzle state funds or assets before they assume office. The norm has been that public office holders swear to uphold Ghana's constitution before they assume office, but the populace considers that although the constitution is the highest law of the land, it does not put sufficient fear in the politician to prevent them from embezzling state funds. They believe that swearing by the river gods will frighten these politicians into good behavior more than the threat of jail term under the constitution or legislation. The river gods will act swiftly once the oath is broken by the politicians and will not hold courts where a lawyer can use technicalities to get a favorable judgment when the politician violates the laws. The interesting takeaway from that submission is that the people had more confidence in the non-state laws of the river gods than in the constitution of the state. This shows as an example of legal pluralism at play in the Ghanaian context. And for our lecture, we are going to deal with these 5 main aspects of legal pluralism. 1. Why study legal pluralism in the first place? 2. What is legal pluralism? 3. How does legal pluralism occur in fact in Africa? 4. How does legal pluralism affect international human rights treaty implementation in Africa? And 5. What is being done and what else can be done to improve implementation of international human rights treaties within Africa's legal pluralistic context? Now, why study legal pluralism in the first place? It is important to study legal pluralism to understand which legal orders actually determine the behavior of a particular people, so that if that behavior violates international human rights norms, then targeted solutions can be presented to respond specifically to those behaviors in order to maximize outputs. 2. What is legal pluralism? Now, John Griffiths, in his article, What is Legal Pluralism?, defines legal pluralism as the presence in a social field of more than one legal order. John Griffiths' article is the first item on the reading list that I gave you at the beginning of this lecture. Now, this definition looks at legal pluralism from the standpoint of the behavior of people. That is, people behaving in ways which show that they are obeying more than one legal order. For instance, in most African countries, two people who wish to marry will first marry under customary law before marrying under the ordinance or statute. They do that to satisfy the traditional customary law requirements, performing all the customary rites and rituals so that their marriage is valid traditionally before they go to be married by a marriage officer designated by the state laws of their country, in order for the same marriage to be valid under state law also. Thus, within the social field of that country, customary law is one legal order and the state law is another legal order. And the people, by ensuring that their marriages are valid under both legal orders, are conforming their behavior to more than one legal order within the same social field of the state. What is interesting is that the state law usually does not require prior marriage under customary law, and neither does the customary law require subsequent marriage under state law. But the people satisfy both legal orders operating within their social field. When more than one legal order operates, individuals could decide which of the systems to make applicable to themselves and their situation, especially if, as happens in most African countries, multiple legal orders are recognized. Now, a short history of legal pluralism in Africa. Scholars of legal pluralism usually recount colonialism as the genesis of legal pluralism in Africa. Of course, as you would find in the second recommended reading, Brian Tamanahe's Understanding Legal Pluralism, Past to Present, Local to Global, legal pluralism can be traced even to the medieval era. But since the scope of this lecture is limited to Africa, I will focus on the history of legal pluralism in Africa. Before colonialism in Africa, most of the areas now designated as African states were chiefdoms and kingdoms. ruled by African chiefs, headmen, or kings. The population ordered their behavior according to the customary laws laid down by their leaders. When colonialism started, the chiefdoms and kingdoms became colonies. So, for instance, there used to be a British colony, and the colonial masters imported their laws. For instance, the English imported the English common law rules to rule the colonies. However, it was frequently the case that the colonial rulers allowed the natives to be ruled by their own native laws in particular situations, unless the colonial masters found the native laws to be unacceptable based on their foreign standards. So they laid down repugnancy tests to determine the acceptability or otherwise of native customary laws. Where they determined that the customary law failed the repugnancy test, they rejected that law and applied their own foreign laws to the given situation. For instance, if the natives' customary laws on inheritance gave more property to the deceased nephew rather than his own children due to the natives' matrilineal system of inheritance, the colonial rulers could determine that the customary law was unacceptable and thus failed their repugnancy test, and therefore reject the customary law and replace it with their foreign laws in which the children of the deceased would inherit more from their deceased father than a nephew. Slowly, this reject and replace strategy began to present an alternative legal order to the people, so that the people saw two different legal orders coexisting, meaning that at any given time a situation was potentially governed by either native or imported law. By the time most African countries gained their independence, there were multiple legal orders operating within those states, and many states chose to maintain that arrangement within their new constitutions after independence. They therefore allowed legislation, customary law, and the received laws of the colonial masters to coexist and operate. The third subtopic is how does legal pluralism operate in fact in Africa? Legal pluralism in post-colonial Africa manifests itself in many ways. We will use the example of disability rights to explain the problem. An African chief may rule that children born with disabilities must be killed because customary law holds that the birth of such children is unacceptable to the gods, and if they remain alive, the gods may be angry enough to annihilate the community. So, to safeguard the survival of the community, customary law mandates the killing of such children. At the same time, a soothsayer may rule that the birth of a child born with disabilities heralds a period of economic doom for the family. Consequently, he advises the parents to kill such a child or bring the child to him to kill for them. Now, all this may be occurring in a country which may be a party to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and that same country may have enacted legislation, that is state laws, to protect the rights of children with disabilities. Thus, at the state level, state laws protect children with disabilities, But at the non-state level, the right to life of children with disabilities are threatened and violated by customary and other laws. So how does legal pluralism in Africa affect the implementation of international human rights treaties in Africa? First, when non-state laws coexist with state laws within the state, implementation of state laws becomes problematic because individuals could opt to conduct their lives in accordance with non-state laws which they find more suitable to their beliefs. In Tamanahe's view, this state of conflict, and I'm quoting here to project Tamanahe's view more strongly. He says, this state of conflict also creates opportunities for individuals and groups within society who can opportunistically select from among coexisting legal authorities to advance their aims, posing a challenge to the legal authorities themselves, for it means that they have rivals. Law characteristically claims to rule whatever it addresses, but the fact of legal pluralism challenges this claim. From the standpoint of a legal authority trying to consolidate its rule, legal pluralism is a flaw to be rectified. From the standpoint of individuals or groups subject to legal pluralism, it can be a source of uncertainty, but it also creates the possibility to resort to alternative legal regimes. End of quote. Now, for instance, during the outbreak of the Ebola virus in 2014, state laws were passed in Liberia in August 2014, banning the burial of persons who died from the virus and requiring that all such corpses be burnt. The reason was that an Ebola victim is most contagious in the moments and days after death, when unprotected contact with infected bodily fluids carries an extremely high risk of transmission. Until the passage of this law, when people die, Liberia's traditional burial practices involve bathing, dressing, and even kissing the corpse. Therefore, cremations in the capital and burials of Ebola victims in body bags outside of Monrovia without relatives being present as the new law required, meant that there won't be a place to honor deceased relatives. Decoration days, where people flock to cemeteries to clean and decorate the graves of relatives, will come and go, and people will not even know where the location of the remains of their loved ones is. This understanding did not sit well with the locals because there is a general, strong African cultural belief in a connection with one's dead relatives, and having a state law which forced a disconnect with a dead relative wasn't going to be accepted by the people. Consequently, rather than obeying the new state law in Liberia, which would have curbed the spread of the virus quickly, people with the Ebola virus stopped attending health centers for treatment, and others secretly buried their loved ones who died of the virus in order not to be deprived of their connection with their deceased relatives, as would be the case if they had reported the disease to the authorities. As a result, the virus spread very quickly and extensively. The Ebola story, which I just narrated, can be found in theguardian.com, and I invite you to find some time to read it for yourselves. A second example of how legal pluralism affects the implementation of international human rights treaties in Africa is that legal pluralism frustrates states' reception of international human rights law because it does not allow for automatic absorption of international law into the state. Now, generally, states are supposed to absorb international law into their domestic legal systems after ratifying the international treaty. Unfortunately, in situations of legal pluralism, which creates states and non-state systems of laws, for the international law to be absorbed into the domestic legal system, it must be absorbed first into the state system and then into the non-state system. This multi-layered approach to state reception of international human rights law, made necessary by the condition of legal pluralism, inhibits automatic state absorption of the international law. Now, this leads me to the third way that legal pluralism affects the implementation of international human rights treaty in Africa. That is, the international human rights treaties may have good intentions, but legal pluralism at the state level could result in the state party being unable to change practices that violate the norms in the first place, and therefore being unable to comply with the treaty. The state party may make laws to protect the rights of children with disabilities and criminalize the killing of children with disabilities. The state laws may even use TV and other educational tools to sensitize the people about the rights of children with disabilities. But then, the people may order their behavior according to their customary laws and thereby still stigmatize or kill children with disabilities. This leads us to the obvious final question: what is being done and what can be done therefore to help improve the implementation of international human rights within Africa's legal pluralistic context? What state parties to international human rights treaties usually do is to use legislative, administrative, and judicial measures to implement treaties. Now, these methods are sometimes specified within the treaty. Sometimes the treaty bodies also specify that state parties should follow these methods in order to demonstrate compliance with the treaty, and they give these recommendations to state parties when they present their reports or even as general comments. But from our discussion of legal pluralism, these old methods do not work in states with legal pluralism. I will refer you to Anne Hillom's book, which was number 4 on the list of recommended readings. Now, to reach the target groups and change the targeted practices, that is, reaching non-state actors whose practices violate international human rights treaty norms, human rights treaty bodies should give targeted inputs to state reports rather than the one-size-fits-all solutions. Secondly, states with legal pluralism should be encouraged to find out what solutions fit the particular context of their countries. That is, identify new avenues for state and non-state actors to act together to facilitate the domestication of international human rights norms and implement those strategies with the overall aim of complying with the treaty norms. And thirdly, non-governmental organizations, activists, and civil society organizations should be mindful of legal pluralism when suggesting solutions to the implementation of international human rights treaties within communities in which they work. This takes us to the end of our lecture today. Thank you for your attention and have a good day.